Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the Monte San Martino Trust's occasional series of Zoominar events. This Zoom is free, but if you'd like to make a donation towards our charitable work, you can do so online via our website, msmtrust.org.uk. And if you do donate, thank you so much for your generosity. Now, today we'll be telling the fascinating story, another fascinating story of POWs in Italy. And it's a story, this one, that we feel sure will be new to most of our supporters. Among the 80,000 Allied prisoners of war held in Italy prior to the Armistice in September 1943 were around 8,000 Indian servicemen, just some of the 2.5 million Indian soldiers who fought on the Allied side. Just how they came to be prisoners in Italy and the unique aspects of their experience is a story that has barely ever been told. Now, this is a truly global Zoom event. Each of our three contributors is speaking today from a different continent, and they will narrate and illustrate aspects of the story of the Indian PoWs in Italy, allowing us to contrast their experiences with those of other Allied prisoners and escapers. Our three speakers have, as I say, given up a lot of their time to prepare for this Zoominar. And they are the Italian historian Costantino Di Sante, and he's going to describe how he discovered some fascinating photographs and information in the Italian archives about Indian PoWs in Italy. Then Annu, an academic and a professor of art, will talk about her research in India into the story of the Indian PoWs in Italy. And Annu is speaking to us from Rhode Island, USA. Costantino, of course, is at home in Italy. And Annu's then going to be followed by Samar Salvi, the grandson of an Indian escaper, who will recount how his grandfather was sheltered by Indians for many months, and how the Indian and Italian families were then reunited after the war. And Samar is speaking to us in the middle of his children's Halloween party from Bangalore in India. All these three talks are going to be richly illustrated, including previously completely unseen photographs from the Italian and Indian archives, showing how the Indian experience was both similar to and significantly different from that of other Allied PoWs. Now, there'll be time at the end for your questions and comments, but you can feed these in as we go along via the Q&A function, which is somewhere on your Zoom screen. So please don't feel you have to wait until the end to ask us a question, and where we can, we'll answer them literally as we go along on the screen. Okay, so it's now to begin, and I'm going to start with Costantino Di Sante, who is director and researcher of the Provincial Institute for the Liberation Movement and Contemporary History at Ascoli Piceno. He is also part of the research group led by the Pari Institute in Milan, which was co-founded by the Trust and which is working on developing a website focused on Allied prisoners of war in Italian. He'll describe his research into the Italian archives, and which is accompanied by some absolutely fascinating photographs. Now, Costantino's English is about as bad as my Italian, so his contribution is going to be mostly read for us by our own John Simpkins, and thank you, John, for doing this. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome Costantino. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Costantino.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you for your invitation to speak today. Special thanks to Nermina Delic, Julia McKenzie, Christine English, and John Simpson. And everyone at to Monte San Martino Trust. Greetings to all those who are listening to us. Sorry, my bad English. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Costantino. Costantino's report tells the full story of the capture, internment, and treatment of Indian prisoners of war in Italian POW camps during the Second World War. Much of his research, as we've heard, is drawn from Italian archives. And today, in addition to hearing his report, we will enjoy a rare opportunity to see some fascinating photographs that he has unearthed. According to Italian documents, the first involvement of the Supreme General Staff of the Italian Army with the issue of Indian PoWs dates back to February 1941. A communication sent to Army Command in East Africa specified that Indian prisoners should be treated in the same way as British prisoners. It also clarified that the ranks of Indian officers corresponded with those of the British Army. As was the case for all Allied prisoners, it was planned to have a reciprocal relationship according to Geneva Convention regulations. Switzerland was designated as the country responsible for safeguarding the interests of all Allied servicemen, including the Indian PoWs, while Spain was responsible for Italians who were interned in India. To start with, one of the greatest challenges facing the Italian Ministry of War was the matter of inspecting the letters written in the Indian language, because there were no suitably qualified interpreters. In addition, some of the Indians in Italy, quotes, being political agitators, unquote, refused to carry out the task of censoring correspondence. It was some months before the ministry managed to find suitable employees, and after that, the Indian prisoners were able to send and receive letters. It is not certain how many Indian prisoners were captured in the first year of the war in East Africa, but we do know that these were the first servicemen taken by the Italians. It is very likely that they were interned in the camps at Adi Ugri in Eritrea and at Forte Cardona in Ethiopia. According to complaints made to the International Red Cross, it seems that conditions at these sites were extremely harsh, and often the Geneva Convention was not observed. In August 1941, a protest was submitted to the Red Cross complaining about the treatment that had been meted out to 27 Indian prisoners in the Horn of Africa. Isolated in a prison cell of, quote, 15 square meters with their hands bound behind their backs, unquote, these prisoners were left for many hours without food and water. They remained imprisoned for 4 weeks, quote, in a hut measuring 150 feet by 50, together with 62 Africans, unquote. There were so many of them that they could not lie on the floor to sleep. More than that, during their transfer from Asmar to the prison camp, they were left for 2 days with virtually no food or water. The directives sent by the Supreme General Defense Staff to East Africa Command are of particular interest. They included the order to make use of some Indian prisoners to instigate anti-British propaganda. One of the first prisoners who was used to try to convert Indians in the POW camps was Lieutenant Shaukat Hayat Khan, described as one of the more hostile voices against British interests in India. Because of his reputation, they pushed for his immediate transfer to Italy, together with another 3 or 4 prisoners. We do not know whether this transfer was made before the liberation of these territories by Allied forces, but it is significant that the Axis powers wanted to use the Indians right from the start. Most of the Indian soldiers were captured in North Africa during the Axis counteroffensive in Libya, particularly during the second offensive in spring 1942. From archive photos, we can see that the soldiers captured in Libya were housed in makeshift camps. These were often no more than temporary fenced enclosures in the sand dunes. As was the case for all British soldiers captured in Libya, the Indians were forced to undergo long marches across the desert before they reached the transit camps, sited near the major cities of Benghazi and Tripoli. Camp 167 at Barche in Cyrenaica was established solely for the purpose of housing Indian prisoners. The prisoners stayed there long enough for health checks, and if they were not suffering from any serious illnesses, particularly viral diseases, they were then transported by sea to Italian ports. There, they were divided up before onward transport to transit camps and then to established camps. It is interesting to look at images taken by photographers from the Italian Army propaganda unit. Obviously, they are curious about their subjects and were probably surprised and intrigued by their facial features, their clothing, long hair, beards, trim moustaches, and their proud bearing. There are, however, other photos in which the portraits intend to show the Indians as ragamuffins. The Italians handed over a proportion of the Indian prisoners directly to the Germans, as early as when they were in camps in Libya. Nevertheless, most of them were sent by ship to Italy. Having arrived at the ports of Taranto, Brindisi, and Napoli, they were divided between various transit camps and thereafter sent on to the established camps. The main transit camps in which the Indian prisoners were held were number 66 in Capua, Naples, 75 in Torre Tresca at Bari, 85 in Tutorano at Brindisi, and 2 camps in Sicily, 98 Castelvetrano at Trapani, and San Giuseppe Jato, which is Palermo. Most Indian PoWs were interned in camps designated for junior officers and other ranks. These were 51 Villa Serena at Altamura in Puglia, 63 Carinaro at Aversa in Campania, 91 Avezzano in the Abruzzo region, Villa Marina at Rome, and Camp 57 at Gruppignano in northeast Italy. Wounded and sick soldiers were accommodated in hospital camps and in some civilian hospitals. The main camps in which there was a marked presence of Indian soldiers, if not almost exclusively Indian, were Avezzano, Villa Marina, and Gruppignano. Like all other inmates, when they arrived at the camps, the Indians were subjected to disinfestation and sterilization of their uniforms. The clothes of many had become infested with parasitic bugs and lice. Most of the camps consisted of wooden barracks, and many prisoners suffered from the cold because of their inadequate clothing. Of all the camps, the most severe restrictions were in place at Gruppignano, whereas in Avezzano camp, despite the ancient buildings left over from the First World War, conditions were acceptable. In this camp, the anti-British propaganda waged by the Italians was very insistent, right from the start. On June the 27th, 1942, the Indian prisoners at Avezzano received a private visit from Mr. Shedai, Secretary General of the Indian society called Friends of Italy, based in Rome. Shedai was hosted by Tenente Colonnello Pietro Tirone, the camp's commander. And about a month later, they were visited by 3 other Indians who had been residing in Europe for some time and who tried to persuade them to enlist in the German army to fight against the Russians. We can see postcards distributed inside the camp intended to make the prisoners feel sympathetic to the anti-British cause. On September the 19th, 1942, the prisoners of Avezzano were even visited by a specific Indian commission on the orders of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The anti-British propaganda had some success, especially among the troops. It wasn't a coincidence that during the winter of 42-43, some Indians opted to go and join German special units that had been set up to fight against Britain and the Soviet Union. To date, we know of 600 Indian PoWs who left Avezzano camp for Germany in August 42. Escorted by German soldiers and 15 Indian soldiers who had already been drafted into the Nazi army, they also took the Indian flag with them. Between the end of 1942 and early 1943, as evidenced by the fall in the number of Indian prisoners in Italian camps at that time, we may assume that a further 2,000 to 3,000 decided to go along with German demands. Compared with more than 8,000 in November 42, there were just over 5,000 Indian PoWs by April 43. As we can see, almost all the soldiers who made this choice were from the lower ranks of the army, hardly any were officers. Perhaps in an effort to encourage their compliance, more attention was devoted to the Indian prisoners in Avezzano camp and also in Villa Marina. Here we can see them playing basketball. Food-related issues were also resolved quickly. For religious reasons, meat was excluded from the diet reserved for the Indians, and their rations included more bread, pasta, and rice. Those soldiers who decided to oppose the anti-British campaign, especially the Sikhs in the Grupignano camp, were subjected to restrictions and deprivation. After the armistice on the 8th of September 1943, a number of Indian prisoners managed to avoid capture and deportation to the Third Reich. Some of them were assisted by local people with whom they had established contact before the armistice. It was often the case that the sale and donation of food, which had been sent to the camps by the Red Cross, ended up in the hands of some of the local people they knew. We have limited information about the Indians who participated in the Italian resistance. Without doubt, this is a story that needs to be written. There is a record, however, of one important episode in the liberation struggle in which some Indian PoWs participated, the Battle of Bosco Martese, which took place on the 25th of September 1943 in the mountains of Terramano in Abruzzo. This is described by Ferruccio Parri, a leading member of the Italian resistance and briefly a post-war prime minister, as the first victorious battle fought in the open by the Italian resistance. Stories are still emerging about Italians who risked their own lives helping Allied PoWs. As we see, there was a post-war flyer that guaranteed financial recompense to those who had done so. We hope that the history of these brave people, as well as that of the many Indian PoWs who refused to enter the fighting on the side of the Nazi fascists, is thoroughly studied so that they are never forgotten. On behalf of Costantino, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And Costantino, thank you for your quite fantastic research. That's really incredibly impressive, the amount you've been able to unearth. And I thought you set it out absolutely beautifully. Thank you so much. That was great. I hope the questions are coming in thick and fast. Do please get your questions ready and put them on the chat function or in the Q&A function as we go along. Well, now it's the turn of Annu Matthew. Annu was born in the UK and now lives, as I said, in Rhode Island in the United States. Her work has been widely exhibited internationally, including at the V&A Museum. Excuse me, I just lost my my words there. She's been doing a lot of work to really understand exactly what happened. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Annu, for your presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just having a problem unmuting my permanent. Oh, there we go. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine, Annu. You're coming through loud and clear.
Great. So thank you all. Before I dive into giving you more context about the Indian soldiers, I wanted to mention what Nick just said, that I was born in England, and one of our close family friends was a British major who had lived in India in the 40s. Major Bill Holmes was like a grandfather to me, and I wish I had asked the questions I have now. Today, I'll also tell you some stories of the Indian prisoners of war and show you a recent art installation that includes their stories. For over a decade, I created work on the partition of British India, where the British arbitrarily created India, East and West Pakistan in 1947. During the partition, over 15 million people were displaced in just 3 months, and over 1 million died. The partition was one of the most violent periods in the 20th century, only exceeded by the killing during the 2 world wars. It was through my decade-long work on partition, where I've been telling the stories of the children of partition, that I stumbled on the stories of the Indian soldiers who volunteered in World War II. Why these soldiers are not remembered is complicated because of independence from our colonial ruler and also the partition of British India. I find it staggering that the 2.5 million Indians' contributions in World War II as a volunteer army are barely acknowledged in India or globally, especially as World War II was truly global with pivotal conflicts in the European, Asian, and African theaters. The more I research, the more complicated this history is. For the 2018 Kochi Musri Biennale Commission, I focused on the Indian soldiers who fought in the Italian campaign. One of the reasons is that the Battle of Monte Cassino was pivotal in winning the war, and the Indian troops played a critical role. Their tenacity is reflected by the fact that they won 30% of the Victoria Crosses for the Italian campaign. To give you some context, in Italy, there are 5 graveyards with the remains of Indian soldiers, 2 just for Indians, 1 for Gurkhas. They're in Arezzo, Cassino, Forlì, Sangro, and Rimini. This photograph is from Cassino. And this is what the graveyard looks like. It has memorial stones and gravestones from all the soldiers from the various colonies who fought with the British. And the Indians are right in the back here under this tree. And this short clip is from Forlì, and it's a graveyard just for Indian soldiers. I projected edited archival footage from the Imperial War Museum that shows the Indian soldiers with their allies in Italy. I did this on the gravestones of the Indian soldiers at dusk and dawn. As art critic Nancy Brokaw wrote, the flickering images of long dead soldiers haunt their own gravesites. So with my husband's help, we were creeping in and out of these graveyards every morning and evening. We didn't actually have permission, and we were wondering if we were going to get caught. On the last day, the last hour, the police arrived. And I'm a real wimp, but my husband is a photojournalist and said, I'll handle this. So when the policeman walked up, he said, pointed at me and said, Indian artist. And the policeman said, artist, no problem. And I took a photograph with him. So this clip is a clip from the final video. So this video is installed with a reflection pool as a metaphor for reflecting on this history. On the opening day of the Kochi Biennale, a friend of mine sent me a photograph of her grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Chakrabarti, standing in his army fatigues in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. What I loved about this photo is that you can connect with the person. As compared to if you do a quick Google for Indian soldiers from World War II, what you get is headshots. And for someone outside of a military family, I don't connect with those. So it has sent me down this rabbit hole of sorts to collect or crowdsource family photographs from some of the photo albums of these families. And this is how I came across some of the stories of the Indian prisoners of war in Italy. I've been collecting these family photos for over 2 years from a range of people from different religions, castes, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And in the process of learning about this history, ask why is this history not part of our collective narrative in South Asia or globally? To give more context to what was happening at the time, the independence movement was going on in South Asia. It was well established that the British India's movement, independence moved soon, it was well established that British India's independence soon after World War II was also born from the Quit India movement and the INA, the Indian National Army led by Subhash Chandra Bose. The Red Fort trials by the British of the INA soldiers ramped up our passions for independence and was the nail in the coffin of the British rule of India. The Bombay Mutiny by the Royal Indian Navy of 1946 was an example of this. The INA soldiers' logic was my enemy's enemy is my friend, with the British colonizer being their enemy. The INA fought with the Japanese and against the Allies and in Kohima, another critical battle, and as was mentioned before, with the Germans too. They're also heralded as heroes in India for fighting the British colonizer rather than joining them. But why are the contributions of the Indian soldiers not acknowledged? Were they part of this larger narrative of getting independence? I would argue that they were, that South Asia achieving independence was a confluence of all three, the Quit India movement, the INA, especially with the Red Fort trials, and the Indian soldiers. Yes, this is a complicated narrative and history. Can all three be acknowledged? The contributions of the South Asians are a reminder of our colonial past, a past that we cannot erase. Getting to who these people were, some were from middle-class families, some from royalty, and some from low-income families. Some were swashbuckling young men who believed in the cause. And others joined out of poverty in search of a regular meal and salary, exasperated by the human-made famine by the British in Bengal, which spread to other parts of India. Here is one of the stories that I heard. This is Lieutenant General Kala's story. He left his wife of 6 weeks to fight in another continent. He was captured at the siege of Tobruk in Libya in 1941 and sent to the prisoner of war camp in Avezzano, Italy. Kala picked up a smattering of Italian during his time at the camp and escaped with his friend Sandhu. They managed to convince a carpenter farmer, Fabriano, to shelter them till the war was over. And this is Fabriano's family. Fabriano suggested to Kala to cut his hair because he was Sikh, he had long hair, so that he could pass as being Italian. And Kala did that. Kala's gratefulness and friendship with the Italian farmer and his family continued, and they corresponded in Italian for decades until Lieutenant General Kala passed away. Kala and his wife Hansa also went back to Italy to visit the family. Brigadier Jamshed Vakil was another prisoner of war in Italy, in Averso and later Avezzano, and finally in Germany, in Brunswick. He became the military attaché in Iran from 55 to 58. His wife, Gul Vakil, was engaged to him just before the war and waited 3 years to marry him when he was released from Brunswick by the American troops. When he escaped as a prisoner of war, he was sheltered by an Italian family. Shireen, his daughter, is still in touch with their daughter, Ernesta Boccaletti, who may be on this call today. So what am I going to do with these photographs? My role as an artist is to take that abstract number of the 2.5 million Indian soldiers who fought in World War II and transform it into something tangible and accessible by any audience. Art can play a crucial role in shaping remembrance, challenging how we have internalized narratives of World War II. But I'm also aware that some of these families do not have family photographs. In my recent exhibition at the Newport Art Museum, I scrolled the names of the 87,000 plus Indians who died, along with their age, position, the parent's name, and sometimes the wife's name, making the viewer aware of the range of positions and socioeconomic differences. So I project this edited footage from all three theaters onto the dhotis as a screen, and it includes 3D laser cut crystals of the family photographs with audios of the story. And this just gives you a walkthrough of the space.
My grandfather was one of these soldiers. He contracted cholera at the war front in Assam in 1943 and was shipped back to Kirki, where he died 12 days before my father was born.
My father wrote home, sending photos and postcards of the murals and sketches he made. It was his way to shift his thoughts from the atrocities and hardships of war and retain his humanity.
My father-in-law was orphaned at a very young age. Because of his early childhood experiences, he was attracted to the stability of the army and found himself on a boat to Italy when he was barely 24 years old. He once told me, as a doctor, I was taught to save lives. My experience in the army was different.
I'm going to skip this one. So I've also collaborated with my colleague from the libraries, Professor Julia Lovett, to create an online exhibition of all the images that are as crystals, so people can find out their names and their stories online. And my goal is to create a larger database of all the images I created, which is over 150, that will be archived and housed at my university. And this will be publicly accessible by anyone. So another prisoner of war story is a photograph of these 5 prisoners, which includes Samar Salvi's grandfather, who's going to be speaking next. This is the original photograph, and from the chat, I found out that the name of one of the brothers is not Murafat Ali. I'm pretty sure I got this information from R.G. Salvi's book, but I would love to talk more about this. So I'm going to play just a snippet of Salvi's story, which is in my installation, but I'm not going to give away any of the characters which Salvi will be talking about.
He actually masterminded an escape plan. And the amazing part is they escaped in the middle of the night and they walked and walked and walked. They followed a railway track for as long as they could go. And then suddenly they heard church bells and they just walked towards the church bells and they came to this beautiful little village called Villa San Sebastiano.
So what's next? I'm fascinated by the Indian prisoners of war who escaped from their camps when they were temporarily left unattended during the Armistice in 1943. I've received over 10 stories and I'm still looking for more. So do let me know if you have any stories of these Indian prisoners of war. I've also been collaborating with Major General Syed Ali Hamid, who is researching General Sahibzada Yaqub Khan, or SYK, who was also a prisoner of war in Italy. If you have any information on him, do let me know so I can pass it on. Recently, through Ali, I was connected to the wife of one of these people in this photograph. And it was one of the brothers, and it's not Sharafat, it's the other brother whose name I don't have correctly right now, and I will be corrected after this session. The story also includes a love interest with an Italian woman. Recently, through Major General Ali, I connected, as I mentioned. So I have read the book that was sent to me, and all the facts don't line up with Salvi's story. And so that's my next task, is to figure out where some of the differences are and to clarify those. In closing, my multimedia installation also begs the question of who else is not acknowledged and helps shape new perspectives. We are at a moment where memorials and histories are being reevaluated and reconsidered in significant ways. Art can play a crucial role in shaping remembrance by pulling back the veil on forgotten histories. My objective is to leverage visual media to elevate this narrative and integrate it into our shared historical and cultural legacy. I'm going to end on these two quotes. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and art is the highest form of hope. Thank you very much.
Annu, thank you for an incredibly moving and fascinating presentation. It's wonderful to see the material you have unearthed and the human stories and the human tragedies that lie behind all those photographs. Absolutely fascinating, and such an important topic. As you say, over the recent years, I guess we have all become a bit better at remembering and paying tribute to those whose bravery led them to fight in terrible world wars and since. And it's just marvelous the way you've combined your wonderful artistic talent with your historical interest and your cultural interest to produce really quite a fascinating story, and one which absolutely must be remembered. It's part of our shared history, whatever the history between our two nations, and unhappy though it was in so many ways. It's great to think that thanks to your research, we can now perhaps move forward positively to remember effectively these incredibly brave Indian soldiers and the part they played in the Second World War. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about your presentation. But now, thank you, Annu. And now I'm going to hand over to Samar Salvi. Samar started his career with Hewlett-Packard in Bangalore and worked internationally, including in the UK, where he spent 10 years before returning to India. He's a British citizen and currently a global vice president heading finance strategy and transformation for Cushman & Wakefield, the well-known global property advisors and consultants. Samar, you're going to tell a very personal story, I know, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you're not in too much trouble with your children at their Halloween party.
No, it's all good. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Costantino and Annu. I think those were fabulous presentations and difficult to follow, but I'm going to share a special journey with everyone on the call today, and it's a journey which is very close to my heart, and also in two parts. One is actually the original journey of my grandfather, and then the second part of the journey is the journey that I embarked upon based on my grandfather's experiences. So my name is Samar Salvi. I haven't done anything as much as my grandfather did during the war. I was just fortunate to be his grandson, hear his stories, and then be here today to relive some of those to you guys on the call today. I'm going to start with when my grandfather actually joined the army. So, my grandfather, R.G. Salvi, or Ramchandra Salvi, joined the Indian Army at the ripe age of 25. This was not an easy task for him. I think as a lot of young patriotic Indians at that time, he was very keen to join the army. And eventually he did at the age of 25 in January 1941. And it was a year later, so a little more than a year actually, in March 1942, after a year of training, and that's a file photo of my grandfather when he was 25 years of age, and he left with some of his colleagues for North Africa, for Cairo actually. And at that time they had no idea what was in front of them, what was going to happen, whether they would come back to see their homeland again or any of that. But very quickly after going to Cairo, they were shipped to Tobruk. And in June of 1942 was when his real experiences started with the Indian Army, where they had identified an enemy camp that was nearby. And Lieutenant Salvi at the time was asked to spearhead a small contingent of soldiers to try and go and destroy that enemy. And unfortunately, they weren't successful. They were actually very successful in saving their lives, because there were a few bullets and enemy shells that actually almost got to them. But eventually, unfortunately, one of the enemy shells hit their carrier, and they were thrown far away from their vehicle where they were, and eventually captured by the Germans and taken as prisoners of war. Now, this happened in June 1942, and this actually relates pretty well to Costantino's original story that he shared with us. But a year later, so from June 1942 to August 1943, they actually traveled through numerous prison camps, and they finally landed up in what I just learned was called Camp 91 in Avezzano, where most Indians were held, as per Costantino's research as well. But it's incredible to actually see the journey that happened between Cairo and Avezzano, and I'm going to share that with you on the next slide. But this is again a photograph that my grandfather sent from one of those prison camps. I think this was sent from the Aversa prison camp back home to his family in India. September 1943 was, I think, where this story completely turned and twisted. And he was fortunate, after many attempts, he was fortunate to actually mastermind an escape plan, and along with 4 others who are in the photograph here. And I must touch base with the Rao family, who have sent a chat message stating one of the names were probably incorrect in my grandfather's book. So I'm going to take that as an action to do after this talk. But the four prisoners plus my grandfather, 5 of them actually escaped. And it's a really interesting story actually, because the Germans would often, it was normal protocol for the Germans to allow a group of 3 or 4 prisoners to go out on parole and find other escaped prisoners and bring them back to the camp. And the way they did this were, they were given 2 sets of they had to sign 2 sets of documents. One was kept back in the prison camp, and one was sent with these prisoners as they were on parole duty to find other escaped prisoners. So if they were caught by German soldiers, they could show this document and they would not be shot at. But there was always a time limit to these documents. So in my grandfather's case, I think they had 3 days when they were on parole. And as luck would have it, the German officer handed over the signed copy to my grandfather and kept the copy that was not signed for himself, which was a big blunder at that time. And my grandfather and the other 4 prisoners seized the opportunity and actually used that to escape, where they ran in the middle of the night and they reached a really quaint village of Villa San Sebastiano. And I think Annu shared this at the end of her presentation. They actually followed the church bells in the middle of the night and eventually got to this village called Villa San Sebastiano. For everyone's benefit, I've tried to show a quick map here. So those familiar with Rome, Avezzano is in the district of Abruzzo in Italy, and that was prison camp number 91, where most Indians were kept. And Villa San Sebastiano is not too far from it. In today's day and age, it takes about 20 minutes by car between Avezzano and Villa San Sebastiano. So that's just a bit of a geographical representation of where it is today. 1943 to 1944. So this was the big year. And this is the year where I think this story completely unfolded, because it was nothing short of a dramatic movie. I mean, these prisoners were really helped by local Italian families. They housed them, they hid them in their houses, they hid them in the mountains, they hid them in the caves. They weren't able to give food to them on a daily basis. They would, literally go between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning when it was, really dark and when the Germans were fast asleep, as the Germans were, often frequenting it inside the village. There were only about 4 families, and I must mention these 4 families. There was Romano Berardi, who was also an Italian soldier at the time. There was Adelina Piacente, Sirio Valente, and Ederlo Antonelli, who were the 4 families, the 4 local Italians who were part of Villa San Sebastiano, who actually helped these escaped prisoners not only to stay alive, but to risk their own lives and made sure that these guys got food, water, etc. as they were hiding through various parts. And I'm going to show you a few images as well, which will make this whole surreal experience a little more real for us in the modern world. Italy, as we all know, at some point left Germany and of course went to the side of the Allied forces. It was only in June 1944, so a whole year after being captured, or rather 2 years after being captured, it was only then that my grandfather and the other prisoners were able to walk around freely in the village. My grandfather actually got command of the villages at the time by the Allied forces. So it was a very, very weird experience for him as well, where he was hiding for about a year in this village. And a year later, he actually got command of these villages for a very short period of time before September of 1944, when with a very heavy heart he actually decided to leave. Well, he had to leave Villa San Sebastiano and Italy and come back home to India, meet his family who he had left behind, and had all these lovely stories and experiences that he took away with him. In December of 1946, my grandfather got married to Hansa Salvi, who was my grandmother. And 21 years later, in June of 1965, he was a major by then in the army, Major Salvi, along with his wife, Hansa Salvi, decided to visit Villa San Sebastiano after 21 years and meet the families who had helped them escape and helped them stay alive. Here are some really amazing photographs to see. So this was Romano, who was a soldier in the Italian army at the time that my grandfather and the other prisoners met him in Villa San Sebastiano. And this young lady was Adelina. And both of them played an absolutely instrumental job in, not just helping my grandfather, but helping all the other prisoners as well. And this was 1965, 21 years later, where my grandfather, along with Romano, are both seen balding here and relatively much older than what they were. That's Hansa Salvi. That's Adelina, the young girl in this photograph is Adelina here 21 years later. And Romano's son Fabrizio is seen in this photograph as well when they met 21 years later. It was only almost 20 years after that, it was only in 1983, when my granddad was around 67 years, did he start writing about his experiences in the war and experiences about, how he escaped, how he met the other prisoners, etc. And it was around the 83 or 84 timeline when he published a book called Whom Enemies Sheltered. It was, I think, published originally in one of the Indian languages and later translated into English. And sadly, at the age of 71 in July 1987, my grandfather passed away, leaving behind 4 children, 3 of whom I believe are on the call today. I think I saw them in the participant list, and 7 grandchildren. So the four children have 7 children, and the family is very much around in different parts of the world today, and most of us, I think, are on the call here today. I do want to quickly touch upon 2 stories within this journey and timeline that I shared with you. One is, when about a year of moving around from prison camp to prison camp, and it links into what Costantino shared with us as well. So I'll go to that first. So this was just to outline their journey, where they started from Cairo, they went to Tobruk in Libya, then went to Derna in Libya, then moved to Benghazi, and I think Costantino mentions Benghazi as well in his research. From there, they actually went by sea to Lecce in Italy. From there to Aversa, which is where he sent that photograph that we looked at. And from Aversa, finally to Avezzano, Camp 91, where most Indians were held captive. This was just to show you guys the journey that they took. I do want to, it wasn't the longest year that I talk about, between 43 and 44, was not at all a year that was a bed of roses, as you would imagine. It was a lot of hardship, a lot of weeks without having baths, a lot of weeks without not seeing another human being, as they were hiding in caves in the mountains in bitter cold. As you would imagine, Indian soldiers were not used to that kind of climate. But this was a very, very beautiful exchange between Adelina and my grandfather. And these messages were passed through shepherd's boys. And I think it kind of summarizes, the torture, the mental torture they went through during that time. I'm going to read this out very quickly. Dear Adelina and Romano, we are sick and tired of our life here. We have not seen Romano for a long time, and nor are there any hopes of seeing him in the near future. The shepherd boys too have stopped coming this side, and so we have nothing to eat. Leading this cowardly life of hiding all the 24 hours of the day is getting on our nerves now. We feel it might be better to even surrender to the enemy and put an end to this sort of existence, or we could make an earnest attempt to join our allied forces. Regards, Salvi. To which he received a very moving reply from Adelina. Salvi, I was extremely upset to read your note. But believe me, I am also in as bad a condition as you are. The Germans have arrested my mother and taken her away from the village. And now they are after my blood. I am therefore in hiding. If I am caught, I am sure they will torture me and maybe even kill me. If you all decide to join the Allied forces, please take me with you. My life here in the village is in danger. However, whatever the circumstances, do not surrender to the enemy. Please do not lose courage. Let us hope that everything will be all right soon. I also do not get anything to eat and have to depend on others' sympathy. I am sending herewith half a loaf of my bread. Please accept it. I cannot send anything more than that. Whatever happens, do not think of surrendering. My only desire now is to see you all free. Adelina. And I just want to narrate a really quick story here, where my grandfather talks about he hadn't seen Romano for a very long time. And this is a story I learned many, many years later, as I had the privilege of meeting Romano's wife, Nilde. But during this period, Romano was actually captured by the Germans and beaten up, where he was black and blue and bleeding in his face. And he refused to meet my grandfather or the other prisoners for over a month, because he didn't want them to know what had happened to him. And this is a story my grandfather never knew about. And, it was only much, much later that I learned, and it made me realize even more the humanity and the love and the friendship of these Italians who were quote unquote enemies at the time. What happened after that? So as I said, my grandfather passed away when I was 7 years old. Unfortunately, I have many memories with my grandfather, but unfortunately, we never sat down and spoke about the war or any of the stories around his war. I only read his book when I was, I think, 12 or 13 years old. And I was blown away by the experiences that he had. And as a young boy, it was always my dream to go back to this village, find the families, and tell them how grateful we were as a family for what they had done for my grandfather and the other prisoners. So what happened? This is Samar and Bijal, me and my wife, we decided to go to Villa San Sebastiano one fine Sunday afternoon in June 2010. I still vividly remember, it was the 20th of June 2010. The World Cup football was going on. Italy was to play at 4 o'clock in the evening. We landed up in the village at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was not a soul in sight. In hindsight, of course, we realized the Italians love their siesta, so everybody was resting before the big football game. But we actually went back and forth the streets of Villa San Sebastiano at least 30 minutes before we finally met Luciano. Luciano Gargano is actually on the call today as well. And Luciano was a kind gentleman who we met at the side of the road with very broken English at the time. Luciano has improved his English since then. But, he, within a matter of a few minutes, Luciano rang 4 or 5 doorbells. And suddenly there was a gathering of about 20 people in the middle of the road trying to help us locate these families, everybody frantically making a few phone calls, finding out where Adelina's family had gone, where Romano's family had gone. And it was just amazing to see. In 5 minutes, we had gathered, a part of the village, and everyone was trying to help us understand what the book was about. In October 2010, so we went back to London in June 2010. And in October 2010, I get an email from Luciano saying that he has actually gone and found all these 4 families, and they couldn't believe that we had come to the village, and they all wanted to meet us. They all wanted to hear the story, and they all called us back to the village. And my wife and I, Bijal and I, went back in October 2010 to Villa San Sebastiano, and we had the most unbelievable reunion with obviously not the original family who had all passed on since then, but their couple of generations after them. We had a really, really good reunion with all of them. Lots of wine, lots of laughter, lots of food, and lots of storytelling. In November 2010, once we went back to London again, Luciano took it upon himself to start translating my grandfather's book. He took, I think, a page and a half every day and started translating this book into Italian. And I know this because he would randomly send me emails saying, what does this word mean in English? Or what does this word mean when your grandfather talks about this? So I knew he was translating the book, even though he kept it a secret from me and didn't tell me. Finally, in May 2011, Luciano comes to England. He came and stayed with us for a couple of days. He actually showed us all the work that he had done around the book. And he and I sat down and agreed that we would launch the book in August of 2011. In August of 2011, we actually launched the Italian book in the village of Villa San Sebastiano. We were, I think, between 13 and 15 of my family members. So Major R.G. Salvi, his 4 children, and their children. We were about 13 or 14 of us who came from different parts of the world into Italy. We spent a beautiful time in Villa San Sebastiano. We presented the village with a plaque, which still stands today, and I'm going to show you a photograph of that very soon. And it was the most unbelievable experience. And I think Nick asked me this question at one point: am I still in touch with the families? And yes, very much so. Luciano and I talk very often. The love and friendship between us has continued since that day. Luciano's son and me are the same age, so he treats me like his second son. And every time I go back to Italy, I have to visit Luciano. I have to visit the village, and it's just a lovely reunion all over again every time I go back. I'm now going to share some images with you guys just to show you, a bit of the village, past and present, a bit about my grandfather's book, and a few interesting moments. So this was the original book my grandfather had written in English, which was titled Whom Enemies Sheltered. And this is what we did to it in 2011, once translated into Italian. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that because I'm sure I'm going to make a mistake, but eventually it translates to Whom Enemies Sheltered. This is a file photo again of Villa San Sebastiano in 1942 that I got from my grandfather on the left-hand side. It's actually in his book that he has written. And this is a photograph I clicked in 2011, which is actually, when you look at the left side, it's the main road of the village, which turns left. There's a little divider in the middle of the road, and there's a house beyond that. That's exactly what you see on the right side as well, of the main road turning left. That's your divider in the middle, and then there's a house behind that. That's what the village looks like today. Some interesting moments. This is the first time I met Luciano on that 20th of June 2010 in the middle of Villa San Sebastiano, where I presented him a book, my grandfather's book. And the next 4 are the 4 families who I met. So this was Nilde. Nilde was, or is rather, Romano's wife. Romano married Nilde, who was, I think if my memory serves me correct, 15 to 20 years younger than him. Nilde is still alive today. I meet her every time I go back to Villa San Sebastiano. She's the one who narrated a lot of stories about Romano and Romano being captured and not wanting to tell Salvi about the fact that he was captured and beaten, etc. This in the middle is Isabella. Isabella is Adelina Piacente's daughter. Again, a fabulous meeting with Isabella. Sadly, Isabella has left us since this meeting in 2010, but we shared a lot of lovely moments, and she too recalls her mother talking very fondly of my grandfather and the other prisoners as well. Here on the left, we have Paolo Valente, who is the son of Sirio Valente, another gentleman who helped the prisoners a lot in Villa San Sebastiano. And the last photograph we have is of Alfredo Antonelli, who is the son of Ederlo Antonelli, who again played a super influential role in making sure messages were passed across from my grandfather to the British Embassy in the Vatican City. I've got a few interesting moments here.
Samar, can I just interrupt you to
Sure.
say we're running a little bit short of time.
All right, I'm on my last slide. Thank you.
Okay.
So interesting moments here. So this is Ivana. Ivana was a 12-year-old girl who remembered walking up the mountains to the cave to leave bread and milk for my grandfather in the middle of the night. And we met her when she was, I think, about 80 or 82 years old in 2010. This was the moment that led Luciano and me to, want to translate the book into Italian, because all the people of the village were just in awe of the English book, but sadly couldn't read the English language, and therefore we had to translate it in Italian. This is the monument that stands in the village today as a remembrance to all the soldiers who've lost their lives in World War I and II. Again, just a few snapshots there of August 2011 when my family went to Villa San Sebastiano for the first time. The one on the top left is the launch of the Italian book. That is Luciano ecstatic on the day of the launch. This was a rare photograph of Luca, who was Romano's grandson, and that's myself with him, which was Major R.G. Salvi's grandson, so the two grandchildren meeting. And this was the moment we presented the plaque to the village. This is my last slide. This actually is the plaque at the village, which is obviously in Italian, but very quickly in English: a saga of love in the midst of World War II, in loving memory of the hundreds of kind souls of Villa San Sebastiano, led by Adelina Piacente, Romano Berardi, Sirio Valente, and Ederlo Antonelli, who put their very lives on the line to give shelter to the 5 POWs of Indian origin. Second Lieutenant Salvi, together with Lieutenant D'Souza, Sarto, Sharafat, and Murafat, escaped from a German prison camp in Avezzano between September 43 and September 44, escaped the German reprisal thanks to the courage of the inhabitants of Villa San Sebastiano. Without your loving help to Lieutenant R.G. Salvi, we would not have existed. With gratitude, the Salvi family. And this plaque stands in Villa San Sebastiano even today. With that, I will say thank you. Before leaving you, I will state this photograph up here is the location of Adelina's house, where my grandfather used to hide in sheds which looked like this on the left-hand side. It's a much newer and renovated house today, but this was just to give you a glimpse of what a house looks like in the village today and what it looked like many, many years ago. So with that, Nick, thank you so much once again for the opportunity. I will hand it back to you and take any questions if there are.
Oh, thank you so much, Samar. That's an absolutely wonderful story. And I love it that you've established such a strong link with the village and that you go back, and that lovely memorial, and how wonderful to be able to share that book with them in Italian, and for your grandfather's story to be properly told back to the Italians who, as you rightly say, risked their lives to help him. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. And thank you so much for sharing it with us. Now, I'm delighted to say we've got lots of comments and questions that have come in both over the chat function and through the question and answer function. So I'm going to whiz through one of those and invite our panelists to respond where appropriate. Yes, here's one question from David Harrison. Do any of the panelists know what happened after the war to the Italian soldiers who decided to go to Germany and fight with the Nazis? Is anybody able to shed a light on that? Annu, you're muted.
I think you mean the Indian soldiers?
The Indian soldiers, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
What did I say? Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I can, the ones who fought with the Germans were also part of the INA, the Indian National Army. And from what I haven't researched too much about it, but from the little I know, when they returned back to India, many of them were not allowed to join the Indian Army after independence.
It's clearly an area for a bit more further research. And I've got a comment here from Galaxy, who says, my research leads me to the hatred against British imperial occupation and rape of the indigenous Indian economy. The Indian resistance movement created by an Indian student studying in Germany called the Flying Tigers. They wanted to drive the British out of India, so agreed to throw their lot in with the Germans. And can we blame them? This is a long story I'm still going to tell. So Galaxy, we really look forward to hearing your really important contribution on that issue. There's a question here from Matteo, an Italian student, whose question really is about how the Indian POWs in Italy were treated in the camps. He wants to know if they were tortured and what their general conditions were like. Samar, I'm guessing your grandfather's book might shed a bit of light on that.
Yeah, I mean, from what my grandfather talks about from the Avezzano camps, at least, there wasn't any evidence of being tortured. And I think Costantino's research also goes in the same direction, where Avezzano was, maybe not as restrictive as some of the other camps. So I haven't heard of any stories really from either my grandfather's book or anywhere else that talks about torture.
I can answer a little bit about that. As I mentioned, about a month ago, I received this manuscript, which is on Khilafat Ali Rao's story. And in that, the two brothers were actually separated in two different camps. And the camp he was in, they were treated really badly, and his brother didn't even recognize him when they eventually met again. From the clothing, the way they were treated, to the clothing, everything was, apparently he lost lost weight completely and was a bag of bones. So it does seem in certain camps they were treated badly.
And Annu, I think that's true of the treatment of Allied POWs generally. In some camps, conditions were relatively mild. Certainly where my father was in Fontanallato, it was quite a luxury camp, actually a bit of a show camp. And being all officers, they were treated relatively well. Whereas, I mean, for example, the camp at Chieti, the Allied prisoners there were really treated very badly and conditions were very hard. And I think it did vary from one camp to the other. And I think, it would just be interesting to know if there was any difference between the way the Indian prisoners were treated and the rest of the Allied prisoners. Costantino, I don't know whether you're able to follow this English conversation. Do you have any thoughts about this question of treatment of the POWs, particularly the Indian POWs in Italian camps?
Nei campi italiani le condizioni variano, no? Da situazione a situazione. Come giustamente dicevi Nick, c'è quello di Chieti molto duro, anche quello di Gruppignano, anche per una questione climatica, e dipendeva molto anche dai comandanti in alcuni casi. E in alcuni campi le condizioni furono più dure, appunto per le situazioni proprio delle strutture, anche di come erano organizzate, e magari suppellettili, o perché erano vetuste, non erano così, come dire, soprattutto per il freddo, non erano confortevoli come altri. Però per esempio non ci furono delle torture sistematiche, ma solo delle punizioni che venivano inflitte magari diminuendo il cibo, mettendoli magari in isolamento perché avevano fatto qualcosa che non andava all'interno del campo o tentato magari di evadere o di organizzare un'evasione. E generalmente però ci sono dei casi dove non fu rispettata, ma generalmente soprattutto per i soldati alleati, in generale britannici, anche per gli indiani, la Convenzione di Ginevra si cercò di rispettarla. In alcuni casi non fu proprio possibile, anche per la grande confusione e impreparazione con cui questi campi furono istituiti durante la guerra. E qual era il problema? Sempre una questione di reciprocità. Siccome anche dei soldati italiani si trovavano in India, in campi diciamo sotto erano stati catturati dall'esercito britannico, ma si trovavano in India, anche lì arrivavano dei rapporti sulle loro condizioni, come arrivavano dei rapporti tramite la Croce Rossa Internazionale soprattutto, e delle varie commissioni e di chi ne tutelava il rispetto dell'applicazione della Convenzione di Ginevra, no? I rappresentanti degli stati neutrali, e quindi per una questione di reciprocità si cercava di non creare problemi, perché magari questi problemi ai prigionieri britannici che trovano in Italia poi potevano, diciamo, di conseguenza subirli anche gli italiani prigionieri in India o in mano ai britannici. Rispondo a altre due domande, John? Posso rispondere?
Nick,
Allora,
Nick, maybe Costantino answer two other questions.
L'altra questione, se furono separati dagli altri ranghi britannici, effettivamente i prigionieri indiani spesso rimasero insieme ai loro comandanti indiani. Diciamo, ci sono dei campi dove troviamo ufficiali indiani, sottufficiali indiani e anche la truppa. E anche, per esempio, della truppa di altre, diciamo, di altre nazionalità dell'esercito britannico. Mentre gli altri ufficiali britannici, soprattutto generali e via dicendo, furono sì separati dalla truppa e dai sottufficiali. Furono creati dei campi appositi per gli altri, diciamo, comandi britannici. Ma per quanto riguarda gli indiani, ecco, in alcuni campi almeno io trovo, dai dati che ho, sia gli alti ufficiali che la truppa insieme.
Thank you, Costantino. That's great.
Sorry, il Gran Mufti mi chiedevi, John. Perché, perché il Gran Mufti fu finanziato, il Gran Mufti di Gerusalemme, fu finanziato dai nazisti per fare una propaganda via radio soprattutto anti-britannica e anche antisionista, antisemita. E infatti nel dopoguerra, dopo la fine della seconda guerra mondiale, fu catturato, portato in Francia, poi andò in Egitto, riuscì a fuggire in Egitto, a riparare in Egitto, dove continuò a diffondere, ecco, questa propaganda soprattutto antisemita.
Okay, can I move on to a couple of other questions, because I know there's lots of people wanting to contribute here. So thank you, Costantino, for your comments. I've got a great comment here from Steve Sims. Steve used to be a trustee of the Monte San Martino Trust, and he's now chair of the Escape Lines Memorial Society. And Steve, I know you've been a bit poorly recently. Delighted to see that you're firing on all cylinders again now. He mentions that over 20 years ago, on a visit to the area, to Veneto, where his father was an escaper, he was taken to a countryside church, where in the churchyard, or the grounds, and not the cemetery, was a marker for a grave of an Indian prisoner of war who had died. His name was recorded as Sekon Karta Singh. Steve says that he's tried over the years to find out more about this gentleman, but with no luck. Do any of our panelists have any thoughts about where he should look for more information about Sekon Karta Singh? Samar's shaking his head. I'm sorry, Steve. Oh, Annu, sorry.
I mean, I think people in England would know better than me, but you can get the military records from the British archives, military archives, if you have the name and the regiment number to be able to follow, to get the report.
And would the records of Indian servicemen who fought with the Allies also be available through it's our National Archive?
Yes, yes.
Or the MOD. Okay, well there we go. That's a thought for you, Steve. We've got another New Zealander here who's been up since 5 o'clock this morning to listen to this Zoominar. So that's great. Hi, Chris Willis. Your dad, Chris's dad, was in Ceylon at the start of the Second World War and joined this Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps. From there, they went to India. They were shipped to India, I'm not sure where, and he enrolled in the 4th 11th Sikh Regiment. Chris would like more information about the movement of this regiment up to his father's capture in the desert. Chris's dad ended up in PG 49, which is where my father was, and also John's, that's Fontenolato. And whilst he didn't talk very much about the war, I know he was very proud of his association with the Indian Army. So I'm guessing that the answer to you, Chris, is sort of the same as the answer to Steve. That those records about your father's war will be available here in the UK through, I think those if you can get in touch with those regiments, they will have more information, and also through the National Archive at Kew. It's an interesting question. I just wasn't aware of just exactly where all these records might be in the UK, and it would be interesting if you are able to do some more research to feed it through to us, because there may be others in your position. And very interesting that your father was so proud of his association with the Indian Regiment and kept up his link. I've got another one here from Holly. I beg your pardon, Annu, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, sure. No, can I also add that the prisoners of war, after the war was over, the British also had exit interviews with them, and those documents are also in England.
Again, they'd be at the National Archive, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Annu. Okay, I've got one from Holly here, who says, did any Indian POWs stay in Italy after they were liberated? Potete rispondere in italiano, sono una studentessa.
Ho risposto già in chat, penso di no, non ho notizie di questo tipo. Bisognerebbe indagare e incrociare qualche dato rispetto ai displaced person, no? Quelli che poi rimasero come profughi, che avevano difficoltà a rientrare nelle proprie nazioni per vari motivi. E io ho incrociato qualcuno, per esempio, del Bangladesh, ma non nominativi dell'India. Quindi penso di no, perché molti degli ex soldati prigionieri in particolare poi rientrarono in India, quasi tutti. Non so se quelli che erano andati in Germania poi per vari problemi è possibile che siano come sbandati, siano rimasti in Italia almeno per un periodo, però purtroppo mi spiace, non ho notizie.
Okay, moving on, I've got some good news here from Sunita, who is the daughter of Major General A.S. Naravane, excuse my pronunciation. He wrote about his time as a POW in both Italy and Germany, and his book, A Soldier's Life, and wrote a book, A Soldier's Life in War and Peace. So that would be a nice little addition to our collection, I'm sure. Thank you, Sunita, very much for that. Lots and lots of comments about how everybody has really enjoyed all the presentations. Here's one from Campo 65. John, do you know where Campo 65 is? Oh,
pass.
No, okay, well, I'm just testing you there.
Not off the top of my head.
A message from Domenico. The students of a high school here in Altamura in southern Italy have been producing a list of almost 100 Indian PoWs held at Camp 51 transit camp in Villa Serena in Altamura. And he's happy to share this information with us. And he's given his email address there. So,
well, it's possible, Nick, that I'll ask Costantino, but he certainly, as he mentioned Villa Serena as one of the, I think, the transit camps. But Costantino, c'è un ascoltatore che ha seguito la conversazione.
Lo conosco bene, lo saluto, Domenico Bolognesi dell'associazione Campo 65 di Altamura. E loro hanno fatto già un lavoro straordinario di recupero e si spera, perché il campo 65 era il campo più grande in Italia, quello che poteva ospitare un numero importante, si arriverà a oltre la capienza dove arrivare almeno a 12.000 prigionieri, quindi anche svariati ettari, e veramente stanno cercando di recuperarlo, e loro hanno iniziato a lavorare con le scuole e hanno recuperato tanti nominativi, tra i quali soprattutto questi, quello che interessa a noi questa sera, 100 nomi, almeno più di 100 nomi di indiani che sono transitati in particolare per il campo di transito di Villa Serena, perché lì era, diciamo, un campo di transito.
Great, thank you. I've got greetings for you, Samar. From Shireen, whose father, Jimmy Vakil, mentions your grandfather in his journal. They were in Avezzano at the same time. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? That's great stuff. Annu, we have a message from Frank the Planter for you. He's been a battlefield guide for the Italian campaign for 17 years. And he says that the role of the 3 Indian divisions in that theatre has grown, interest in them has grown significantly in that time. There's a monument to the Indian Army now at Cassino. I think it's possibly the one that you showed in your presentation.
No.
And the Sikh monument in Forlì is really quite something. There's also a wonderful monument to the 19th Indian Infantry Brigade in the northern Apennines at Monte San Martino.
Actually, what I showed was not the memorial for the Indians. That was installed this last July. I actually was in Italy at that time, but could not get to Cassino. But this July, finally, a monument has been created for the Indian soldiers from World War II.
Okay, that's lovely. And Frank has communicated again. He's left us, you'll find it on the chat function, his email address, so you can contact him. Okay, I'm just rifling through. Hello, Samar. I'm an Italian boy, and your grandpa's story is fascinating, really. And I wanted to ask you if you are intending to write a book about the further information you got from the Italian families.
Ciao, Matteo. Unfortunately, no. I haven't thought that far, to be honest. But at the moment, it's all sat up here in my mind. But I will absolutely take your advice and think about that. I will at some stage start penning down some of the experiences and stories that I have heard from the other families as well. But I will think about that. Thank you.
I think his story should be a movie.
Yes, I agree. I can't wait to read the book, Samar.
I did try that, Annu. I am. It's still on my bucket list of things to do and make it into a movie. So fingers crossed. Let's see.
Very good. Okay, I've got one from Satyendra Gupta, who is from the Mahoba district in Uttar Pradesh. In Satyendra's neighborhood, there lived an ex-soldier, namely Subhasdar Vikram Nath Singh. He was sent to fight in Ethiopia and then to Italy in a camp. He never came back. The government of India also didn't reply to the family positively. I want to know what the government of India did to relocate and get the Indian PoWs back to their homes after independence. I'm not sure, is anybody, Annu, can you answer that?
I wasn't clear. Did he die during the war, or was or did he survive the war?
He never came back, so it suggests that he did die, yes.
Yeah, so there's two things. One is the Commonwealth Grave Commission has all the names of every soldier, including Indian, who died in World War II. So that would be a way to find more information as to where he died and where the ashes or the grave is in which country. The other thing is, at least from Samar's grandfather's book and from other reading, it sounds as if a lot of the Indians after the war were then taken by ship back to India. And I also wanted to mention, someone asked about Indians staying on. The story of Khilafat Ali Rao, he actually fell in love with an Italian woman and many years later came back. And he met the woman. She had actually never married, but he was married, and so it was kind of like this heartbreaking love story that doesn't have a happy ending.
I suspect there are lots of unhappy endings in this tale. Okay, we've got a comment from Bari. Thanks to you all. It's given me a lot of inspiration to follow up on some of your suggestions, and I'll do my best to forward to you any of my findings. I'm also looking forward to visiting Italy in 2023, hopefully to join you in 80th anniversary celebrations in Fontenato. It is, of course, the 80th anniversary in 2023 of the Italian Armistice, when so many Allied prisoners of war in Italian PoW camps were unable to get away. We've already started thinking about how we want to celebrate that within the Monte San Martino Trust, and we hope you'll all join us wherever we go. We'll certainly keep in touch with you about that. As far as Indians in World War II are concerned, says Sunita, I hope two books in which the Italian theatre is memorably covered are Two Lives by Vikram Seth, in which his uncle, a dentist, lost an arm at Monte Cassino, and The English Patient, of course, in which the Sikh soldier was devastated by the bombing of Hiroshima. We've got, yes, this is Matteo encouraging you, Samar, with your bucket list film. And I think that's just about it. We've got through, I hope, all of the questions. If anybody else wants to type in a question quickly now, please do so. But if not, I'm going to say a huge and heartfelt thank you to all three of our panelists. You've just been quite extraordinarily interesting to listen to and extremely moving as well. John, I know you're going to be putting together this story for our newsletter over the next few months. And I think it would be really interesting for us in the Trust just to look again at how we might do more to either promote this story or at least facilitate research into it, because I think it's an extraordinarily important one. We have recorded today's Zoominar, and we'll be sending it out to all of you who have participated, sending out a link to it. And I hope you've really enjoyed it as much as I have. John, you're asking a question here. Are there any images our speakers have come across of Indian boy soldiers? So John's uncle was 16 and he is currently writing a book about it. Are there any pictures that you found of Indian boy soldiers? Annu, maybe you've seen something like that?
No, I actually haven't. I think he also mentions Muslims, so I'd suggested he look at the work of Guy Bauman, sorry, who's just come out with a book on Indian Muslims who fought in World War II. But I haven't come across any boy soldiers.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to reading your book, Jahan. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's all we've got time for. I really can't thank you enough. Thank you very much to my team from the Monte San Martino Trust, Julia, Christine, John, and Nemina, who've done a wonderful job of putting this Zoominar together. But again, thank you to all the participants. You've just been fantastic. And thank you, all of you, for looking in and watching and listening and asking such interesting questions. I think we've got more to do on this team, don't you? Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Hope you'll join us for our next Zoominar, whenever it is. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.